The billionaire checked his Rolex for the third time while his pregnant wife sobbed over her father's casket. What happened next would cost him everything he'd spent decades building. October rain hammered against the cemetery tent at Riverside Memorial, each drop hitting the canvas like an accusation. Margaret Sullivan Harrison pressed her hand against her 7-month belly, feeling her baby kick as if sensing the grief that consumed her. Her father lay before her in polished mahogany, his battle with cancer finally over, but the war in her marriage was just beginning. She'd been standing there for 90 minutes, waiting. The funeral director had already asked twice if they should delay the service. Margaret's sister Dorothy held her hand, whispering that Henry must have been detained by traffic, by business, by something important enough to miss this final goodbye. But Margaret knew better. The black town car finally appeared at 2:47 p.m. She knew the exact time because Henry's arrival coincided with the church bells that were supposed to signal the start of her father's service. He stepped out, his $3,000 suit immaculate except for one telling detail. The collar was slightly askew, as if hastily straightened in the back seat. Henry Harrison didn't run through the rain. He walked with measured steps, his expression arranged in what he probably thought looked like grief, but came across as mild inconvenience. When he reached Margaret's side, he didn't embrace her. He didn't apologize. He simply nodded to the funeral director to begin, as if this were another board meeting he was chairperson of. That's when Margaret caught it, the scent. Not his usual cologne, the Tom Ford she'd bought him every Christmas. This was something floral, young, completely wrong. It clung to him like evidence he hadn't bothered to hide. Her eyes found his, searching for some explanation, some remorse. But Henry was already checking his phone, thumbs scrolling through messages, while the pastor began speaking about her father's life of integrity and devotion. Before we continue this story of betrayal and ultimate justice, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you believe in karma. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Because what Henry Harrison did next, right there at that funeral, would trigger a chain of events that would destroy his empire 18 years later, orchestrated by the very child he was about to abandon. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if already fighting against the injustice about to unfold. But to understand the cruelty of this moment, you need to know who Henry Harrison really was. At 45, Henry commanded a real estate empire worth $3 billion. He'd started with a $200,000 inheritance from his grandfather and turned it into a machine that devoured struggling properties and transformed them into luxury developments. Newspapers called him the Golden Touch of Philadelphia. His face decorated magazine covers, from Forbes to Architectural Digest. He owned 17 hotels, 43 commercial complexes, and enough political influence to reshape zoning laws with a phone call. 8 years earlier, he'd met Margaret at the Children's Hospital Charity Gala. She was presenting her pro bono architectural designs for a new pediatric wing. Henry had watched her speak with the intensity of a predator spotting prey, but Margaret mistook it for genuine interest. He pursued her relentlessly. Flowers delivered to her firm daily surprise helicopter rides to Manhattan for dinner. Handwritten notes quoting poetry he'd clearly had his assistant research. "You're not just beautiful," he'd told her on their third date, holding her hands across a candlelit table. "You're brilliant. Together, we could build something spectacular." Margaret fell completely. Here was a man who valued her mind, who sought her opinions on his development projects, who promised partnership rather than possession. Their wedding made society pages across the East Coast, 500 guests at the Ritz-Carlton, a reception that cost more than most people's homes. Margaret's father, a humble contractor who'd built his business on handshake deals and honest work, had pulled Henry aside that day. "She's giving you her whole heart," he'd said quietly. "Don't make me regret walking her down that aisle." Henry had gripped the older man's shoulder, looking him straight in the eye. "You have my word." That promise lasted exactly 3 years. Her name was Veronica Lang, though she preferred going by Fifth, 29 years old, fresh from Harvard Business School, hired as Henry's executive assistant with a resume that somehow justified a six-figure starting salary. Five had a talent for numbers, Henry explained when Margaret questioned the late-night strategy sessions. She understood international markets in ways that would revolutionize their portfolio. The transformation happened gradually. Henry stopped asking Margaret's opinion on architectural plans. Her home office, once filled with blueprints they'd review together, became storage for his golf equipment. Date nights disappeared, replaced by client dinners where V's presence was essential for taking notes. Margaret found herself eating alone in their 12,000-square-foot mansion, the silence broken only by the grandfather clock her father had given them as a wedding gift. When Margaret discovered she was pregnant, she'd planned the announcement carefully. A private dinner, Henry's favorite meal, the pregnancy test wrapped in a box from the jeweler where he'd bought her engagement ring. She'd imagined his joy, the way he'd spin her around, already making plans for nurseries and private schools. Instead, Henry had stared at the test stick like she'd handed him a lawsuit. "The timing is unfortunate," he'd said, setting down his fork. "We're in the middle of acquiring 3 properties in Miami. I need complete focus. This is our child, Henry. Your child. I understand biology, Margaret." His tone could have frozen fire. "But the markets don't care about personal situations. Perhaps we should discuss options." That was 6 weeks before her father's diagnosis. 6 weeks before everything shattered completely. Now at the funeral, as mourners began filing past the casket, Henry pulled Margaret aside. The rain had intensified, drumming against the tent like nature itself was angry. He positioned them near a cluster of flowers, away from listening ears but still visible enough to maintain appearances. "Margaret, we need to discuss practical matters. My father is about to be buried, Henry, which is why timing is important. You're emotional, vulnerable. It would be unfair to blindside you later." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I've had papers drawn up. Dissolution of marriage, clean and simple. The house in Bryn Mawr is yours, plus monthly support for the child. My lawyers suggest we cite irreconcilable differences." Margaret's legs nearly buckled. "You're leaving me? Here? Now? I'm being considerate by telling you privately. Five has identified an excellent therapist who specializes in grief counseling and single motherhood transitions." The casual mention of Five in this moment, the practiced efficiency of his cruelty, the envelope he'd obviously carried here planning this ambush. It all crashed over Margaret, like a wave of comprehension. "You've been planning this. I've been practical. Something you might consider." Henry checked his phone again. "The settlement is generous. Sign within the week, and I'll include your father's medical debt in the package. Comment below if you've ever witnessed someone reveal their true colors at the worst possible moment." Because Henry Harrison's betrayal at that cemetery would create an enemy he never saw coming, the son growing inside the wife he just discarded. Now here's where most abandoned wives would crumble, but Margaret Sullivan wasn't most women. The divorce proceedings began 48 hours after her father's burial. Henry's legal team descended like a corporate raid. 7 lawyers from Whitman, Ketchum and Associates, the firm famous for protecting billionaires from their ex-wives. They weaponized Margaret's grief, filing motions while she was selecting her father's headstone, scheduling depositions during what should have been prenatal appointments. "Your client signed a prenuptial agreement," Lawrence Whitman announced during the first meeting, sliding a document across the conference table. "She's entitled to the Bryn Mawr property and modest support. Nothing more." Margaret's attorney, Patricia Reeves, was competent but outgunned. A solo practitioner who usually handled simple separations, she found herself drowning in paperwork, each filing more aggressive than the last. Henry's team claimed Margaret was emotionally unstable, citing her father's death and hormonal changes as evidence she couldn't make rational decisions. They lied about asset values. The Bryn Mawr townhouse, worth $1.2 million, was listed at $300,000. Henry's annual income, actually $40 million, appeared as $4 million on court documents. Hidden offshore accounts disappeared behind shell companies with names like RH Investment Trust XVI. When Patricia requested full financial disclosure, Whitman buried her in 80,000 pages of irrelevant records, knowing she couldn't afford the forensic accountants needed to decode them. Margaret signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in November, her hand shaking not from emotion but from early contractions. The stress had triggered premature labor twice already. Her doctor warned that fighting the divorce could risk the baby's life. "Take the deal," her sister Dorothy urged. "You can't fight him and protect your child at the same time." So Margaret accepted the crumbs Henry offered: the townhouse, $4,000 monthly in child support, and basic health insurance. She gave up claims to the fortune she'd helped build, the properties she'd designed, the future she'd imagined. December 15, 2006. Margaret delivered her son during a blizzard that shut down half of Philadelphia. Dorothy held her hand through 14 hours of labor while Margaret's phone sat silent. No message from Henry, no acknowledgement that his child was entering the world. She named the baby Daniel, after her father, declaring he would carry a name that meant something. The same week Daniel was born, society pages exploded with news. Real estate mogul Henry Harrison to wed business prodigy Veronica Lang. The wedding invitation, leaked to reporters, promised the event of the decade at the Breakers in Newport. The ring Henry placed on V's finger contained a 15-carat diamond that cost more than Daniel's college education would. Daniel grew up observing everything with unusual intensity. At 3, he noticed patterns other children missed, how his mother's smile never quite reached her eyes when other families appeared at the park, how she worked at her drafting table until dawn to afford his preschool tuition. By 5, he was reading at a third-grade level, consuming books about business and economics that Margaret found him studying by nightlight. "Why doesn't my dad visit?" he asked one evening, his small face serious. Margaret knelt beside him, choosing her words carefully. "Some people aren't ready to be parents, sweetheart. It's not about you. You're perfect." Did he not want me? The question broke her heart, but she held steady. "That's his loss, Daniel, his biggest loss." Teachers flagged Daniel's intelligence immediately. His kindergarten instructor called Margaret in, concerned and amazed. "He's calculating percentages during snack time. He asked me about compound interest yesterday. This isn't normal development. This is exceptional." But it wasn't just intellect that set Daniel apart. He possessed an emotional intelligence that seemed impossible for his age. When classmates' parents divorced, Daniel comforted them with wisdom beyond his years. When his mother cried quietly in her room thinking he was asleep, he'd slip drawings under her door, pictures of them together with words like "we're complete" written in careful crayon. By 7, Daniel had taught himself to read financial statements by studying newspapers in the library. By 9, he was tracking stock prices, creating paper portfolios that consistently beat market averages. His 4th-grade teacher discovered him analyzing Henry Harrison's company during recess, methodically documenting every public deal in a notebook labeled "Understanding Power." The boy abandoned before birth was becoming something neither parent could have predicted: a genius with a purpose, a child who transformed pain into fuel for greater ambition. Every slight, every absence, every reminder of his father's rejection wasn't breaking him. It was building him into Henry Harrison's perfect nightmare. While Henry celebrated hostile takeovers, his abandoned son was quietly becoming his worst nightmare. Daniel Sullivan Harrison, though he never used his father's surname, spent his teenage years like a monk preparing for war. While classmates played video games, Daniel studied corporate law textbooks he'd borrowed from Temple University's library using a fake student ID. At 14, he could dissect a balance sheet faster than most CPAs. At 15, he understood merger structures that confused MBA graduates. His bedroom walls weren't covered with posters of athletes or musicians, but with organizational charts of Fortune 500 companies, connected by red string like evidence in a detective's case. "You're 16, Margaret said one night, finding him surrounded by SEC filing printouts at 3 a.m. "You should be thinking about prom, not proxy battles." "Prom doesn't change anything, Mom. Knowledge does." The summer before his senior year, Daniel took a job that horrified Margaret. He joined a construction crew building low-income housing in North Philadelphia, waking at 4 a.m. to pour concrete in 100-degree heat. His soft hands blistered, his back ached, but Daniel persisted with frightening determination. "Why construction?" his foreman asked after watching this obviously brilliant kid haul rebar for weeks. "My father builds towers that touch clouds," Daniel replied, mixing cement with practiced efficiency. But he never touched the foundation. "I want to understand what he ignored, how things actually stand up, not just how they look in presentations." That construction job revealed something crucial. Daniel discovered that Harrison Holdings had built several projects in the area, and the workers had stories. Stories about substandard materials, about inspectors being paid to look away, about corners cut so sharply that experienced builders refused to let their families live in Harrison properties. Daniel documented everything in encrypted files, building a database that would matter years later. His SAT scores were perfect. Harvard, MIT, Stanford, they all offered full scholarships. But Daniel chose Wharton, the same school his father had attended, though he made sure their paths would never cross at alumni events. He arrived on campus with 3 goals: master finance, develop something revolutionary, and remain invisible to anyone connected to Henry Harrison. The algorithm started as a class project junior year. Professor Jennifer Walsh assigned students to identify patterns in corporate behavior that predicted stock performance. While classmates focused on obvious metrics like earnings or revenue, Daniel analyzed something different: the relationship between executive behavior patterns and subsequent company scandals. "This is remarkable," Professor Walsh said, reviewing his preliminary code. "You're essentially creating a diagnostic tool for corporate disease. Disease spreads if unchecked," Daniel replied. "I'm interested in early detection." He refined the algorithm obsessively, feeding it decades of data about corporate failures, fraud cases, SEC violations. The system learned to recognize warning signs, unusual insider trading patterns, specific language changes in corporate communications, the timing of executive departures. By senior year, his algorithm had successfully predicted 3 major corporate scandals weeks before they became public. Venture capitalists started circling. A firm offered $2 million in seed funding during a campus pitch competition. Another promised $5 million if Daniel would drop out immediately. He took the $2 million but stayed in school, registering his company as Integrity Analytics, working from his dorm room between classes. "Why not take the bigger offer?" his roommate asked. "Because patience pays compound interest," Daniel answered, coding through another all-nighter. "And I'm building something that requires credibility, not just capital. Like this video, if you believe patience is the ultimate revenge." Daniel's next move would prove that revenge, served cold, isn't just a saying, it's a strategy. The breakthrough came through LinkedIn, of all places. Daniel received a message from Thomas Rivera, former CFO of Harrison Holdings, who'd been fired 5 years earlier for strategic differences. Rivera had been following Integrity Analytics' early success and recognized something in Daniel's approach, a familiar ruthlessness tempered by ethics. They met at a diner in Trenton, neutral ground away from Philadelphia's business district. "You're Margaret Sullivan's son," Rivera said within minutes, studying Daniel's face. "You have her eyes, her attention to detail, but your analytical mind, that's pure Harrison. You worked for him for 12 years. Why reach out to me?" Rivera pulled out a flash drive, sliding it across the table like a poker player showing his hand. "Because Henry Harrison destroyed my career when I questioned his methods. This contains everything I documented before he had security escort me out. Financial irregularities, safety violations, bribery records. I've been waiting for someone with the skills and motivation to use it properly. Why didn't you go to the authorities? With what proof? Henry's lawyers would have buried me in lawsuits. But you're building something that could expose him systematically, legally, publicly. Your algorithm could find what prosecutors miss. Daniel pocketed the drive, his expression revealing nothing. If I use this, you understand what happens. This isn't just about exposing crime. This is about complete destruction. Henry Harrison taught me that business is war, Rivera replied. He just never expected to train his own enemy's ammunition supplier. That flash drive contained 12 years of insider knowledge. Every questionable deal, every hidden transaction, every executive who'd participated in Henry's schemes. Daniel integrated it into his algorithm, creating a targeting system that would make military precision look clumsy. Daniel had waited 18 years for this moment, and when it came, it lasted exactly 37 seconds. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted by fate itself. Meridian Development, the company Henry Harrison planned to acquire, had been co-founded by Margaret's father 40 years earlier. James Sullivan had built it with his bare hands, starting with one truck and a toolbox, growing it into a respected firm that built schools, hospitals, and affordable housing across Pennsylvania. Now Henry wanted to devour it, strip its assets, and convert its community projects into luxury condos. Daniel learned about the hostile takeover from a Bloomberg alert on a Monday morning in January 2024. He sat in his office at Integrity Analytics, now a $100 million company occupying 3 floors of a Manhattan high-rise, and smiled for the first time in months. He's finally given us the opening, Daniel told his team of 12 analysts, all experts in financial forensics. Start compilation protocol. Everything we have on Harrison Holdings goes live in 72 hours. The evidence they'd assembled over 3 years filled 200,000 pages of documentation. Shell companies in 12 countries, falsified safety inspections on 43 properties, $16 million in bribes to city officials, tax evasion spanning 2 decades. But the crown jewel was something Daniel had discovered himself. 3 building collapses between 2010 and 2019, all in low-income neighborhoods, all using materials that violated federal standards, all covered up with settlements that included ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The shareholders' meeting is Thursday, his lead analyst reported. Harrison needs 70% approval for the Meridian acquisition. He'll get his meeting, Daniel said, purchasing a single share of Harrison Holdings stock through a subsidiary. But not the outcome he expects. Daniel's team worked round the clock, creating a presentation that would destroy Henry Harrison in real time. They coordinated with journalists at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Forbes, embargoing the story until Daniel gave the signal. The SEC received an anonymous tip about irregularities worth investigating, timed to arrive exactly 1 hour before the meeting. The FBI got something more specific. Evidence of interstate wire fraud, packaged with enough probable cause to secure immediate warrants. Thursday arrived gray and cold. The Four Seasons Ballroom held 300 of Philadelphia's most powerful people, investors, politicians, business leaders who'd made fortunes alongside Henry Harrison. They sipped champagne and discussed yacht purchases, oblivious to the storm about to break. Henry stood at the podium, 63 years old but still commanding, his silver hair perfect, his voice carrying the authority of absolute success. 5 sat in the front row, now his wife of 17 years, wearing diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. Their twin daughters, both fresh from Swiss finishing school, flanked her like matching ornaments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henry began, his tone suggesting this was mere formality. "The Meridian acquisition represents the final piece of our East Coast consolidation. Their properties, while currently underperforming, will generate 30% returns once properly developed." That's when Daniel stood up in the back row. He looked nothing like the billionaire real estate mogul. His suit was simple, off the rack, deliberately unremarkable. But something in his posture, the way he commanded attention without raising his voice, made heads turn. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrison. I have a question about liability exposure." Henry squinted at the young man, irritation crossing his features. "Questions come after the presentation, young man. I don't think shareholders can wait." Daniel pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the send button that would release everything. "I'm looking at an FBI statement issued 90 seconds ago. Harrison Holdings assets have been frozen pending investigation into racketeering, wire fraud, and criminally negligent homicide." The room erupted. Phones buzzed simultaneously as Daniel's media contacts published their stories. The Wall Street Journal's push notification read, "Breaking: Harrison Holdings under federal investigation for 2 decades of fraud." "This is preposterous." Henry's face flushed red. "Security, remove this person." "I'm a shareholder," Daniel said calmly, holding up his certificate. "And I'm reading from federal documents. The raid on your headquarters started 3 minutes ago. Your CFO was arrested at his home. Your entire accounting department is being detained." V's face had gone white. She was scrolling through her phone, seeing her own name in the indictments. The twins looked confused, then horrified as social media exploded with details of their father's crimes. Henry gripped the podium, his knuckles white. "Who are you? Who sent you?" Daniel walked down the center aisle, every step measured, every eye following him. As he approached the stage, the overhead lights caught his face fully for the first time. "Look closer, Henry." Recognition hit like a physical blow. Henry actually staggered, his hand clutching his chest. Those were Margaret's eyes, staring back at him. But the analytical coldness, the strategic mind, that was his own DNA turned against him. "Daniel." The name came out as a whisper. "Daniel Sullivan," Daniel corrected. "I never took your name, but I did take everything else." The room had descended into chaos. Investors were screaming into phones, demanding their lawyers. Board members fled toward exits. V was backing away from Henry as if he were radioactive, her survival instincts overriding 17 years of marriage. "You're my son," Henry said, his voice breaking. "No," Daniel replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm the consequence you never calculated, the variable you didn't account for. I'm proof that abandoning your family at a funeral has a price." Federal agents entered through the main doors, their presence turning panic into stampede. Henry stood frozen at his podium, watching his empire collapse in real time, destroyed by the son he'd thrown away before birth. The 37 seconds were up. Daniel turned and walked out, leaving Henry Harrison to face the wolves alone. In 6 months, Henry Harrison went from billionaire to federal inmate, but that wasn't even the worst part. V turned state's witness before the FBI even finished reading her rights. 17 years of marriage evaporated the moment she realized her lifestyle was at risk. She sat in a federal prosecutor's office, perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table, and systematically destroyed the man she'd once called her soulmate. Henry kept 3 sets of books, she told investigators, her voice steady as a news anchor's. "The real ones are on a server in the Cayman Islands. Password is our anniversary date followed by his Harvard graduation year." She revealed everything. The bribes hidden as consulting fees, the building inspectors who received monthly envelopes, the city councilmen who rezoned properties after mysterious donations to their campaigns. He had receipts, recordings, photographs, evidence she'd been collecting since year 2 of their marriage, stored in a safety deposit box Henry never knew existed. "Why keep all this?" the prosecutor asked. "Insurance," V replied without emotion. "Henry taught me that everyone needs leverage. I just learned the lesson better than he expected." Her immunity deal included keeping the penthouse in Manhattan and $5 million in assets she claimed were gifts from before the marriage. Within a week of signing, she'd retained a publicist and was shopping a tell-all book titled Married to a Monster: My Life Inside America's Most Corrupt Empire. The twin daughters' betrayal cut even deeper. Rebecca and Amanda Harrison, both 21, held a press conference at their college, standing before cameras in simple black dresses, their prepared statement precise and devastating. "We renounce our father and everything he represents," Rebecca read, her voice shaking but determined. "We've legally changed our surnames to our grandmother's maiden name, Walsh. Any inheritance we might have received will be donated to families affected by our father's crimes." Amanda took over, tears streaming down her face. "We grew up in luxury built on suffering. We attended private schools paid for with stolen money. We're ashamed of our name, our history, and the man who raised us." The federal asset seizure was surgical in its completeness. FBI agents cataloged every property, every vehicle, every piece of art in Henry's collection. The yacht he'd named Victory was impounded at its Miami dock. His car collection, 43 vehicles including 7 Ferraris, was loaded onto trucks as neighbors watched and filmed. The wine cellar with bottles worth $2 million was emptied, each vintage documented for auction. But the revelation that destroyed Henry completely came from an unexpected source. During the asset investigation, forensic accountants discovered that the Bryn Mawr townhouse Henry had given Margaret in the divorce was actually worth $12 million, not the $300,000 he'd declared. He'd hidden its true value through a web of false assessments and shell ownership, planning to reacquire it after the divorce through a subsidiary. He committed fraud against his own pregnant wife, the lead prosecutor announced at a press conference. This wasn't just corporate crime. This was personal cruelty executed with corporate precision. Margaret learned about the townhouse's true value from Daniel, who visited her on a Sunday morning with the forensic report. "You could sue for the difference," he said, sitting at her kitchen table, the same one where she'd fed him breakfast for 18 years. "I don't want his money," Margaret replied. "I never did." "Then let's use it differently." Daniel pulled out incorporation papers. "The Sullivan Foundation, dedicated to helping abandoned families fight back against wealthy spouses who manipulate the system. We'll fund lawyers, forensic accountants, private investigators, everything you didn't have access to." Margaret signed without hesitation. "Your grandfather would be proud." Daniel's strategic use of Victory was masterful in its restraint. He could have gloated, could have given interviews, could have built his brand on his father's destruction. Instead, he remained silent, letting the work speak for itself. Integrity Analytics' client base tripled as institutional investors recognized the value of ethical oversight. The algorithm he'd developed became the industry standard, licensed by the SEC for regulatory monitoring. But Daniel's most strategic move was hiring Henry's former employees, the ones who'd been laid off over the years for questioning practices or refusing to participate in fraud. He created an entire division staffed by people his father had discarded, each one bringing knowledge and motivation that made Integrity Analytics unstoppable. "You're building an army of the abandoned," his COO observed during a strategy meeting. "I'm building a company of people who understand consequences," Daniel corrected. "Every person here knows what it costs when power operates without accountability." The Harrison Holdings bankruptcy auction was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday in September. The building that had housed Henry's empire for 20 years sold for a fraction of its former value. The buyer remained anonymous until the deed was filed. It was Daniel. He turned the top floor, Henry's former executive suite, into a free legal clinic for abandoned spouses. The office where Henry had planned his conquests now hosted support groups for single mothers. The conference room where he'd orchestrated divorces became a classroom where financial literacy was taught to women recovering from economic abuse. The empire hadn't just fallen. It had been transformed into everything Henry Harrison had spent his life avoiding, a monument to accountability, compassion, and the idea that wealth without wisdom was worthless. Father and son sat across a metal table, separated by bulletproof glass and 20 years of silence. The Federal Detention Center in Brooklyn was a far cry from the Four Seasons ballrooms Henry once commanded. He wore orange now instead of Armani, his inmate number minus 478,293, stitched where monograms used to be. His hands, once manicured weekly, showed rough calluses from kitchen duty. The silver hair that had been his trademark had thinned, revealing scalp that had never seen sunlight during his decades of private jets and chauffeured cars. Daniel had debated this visit for months. His therapist said confrontation could bring closure. His mother said forgiveness would bring peace. But Daniel came for neither closure nor forgiveness. He came for clarity. "You look like her," Henry said first, his voice hoarse from disuse. In prison, the man who'd commanded thousands now spoke to no one. "I look like myself." Henry shifted in his metal chair, the chains around his ankles clinking. "I suppose you're here to gloat. To see what you've reduced me to. I'm here to understand something." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "When you left us at that funeral, when you abandoned your pregnant wife beside her father's grave, did you feel anything at all?" Henry's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't understand. The pressure I was under, the deals at stake." "I run a larger company than you ever did," Daniel interrupted calmly. "My net worth exceeded yours 6 months ago. I understand pressure perfectly. What I don't understand is cruelty. Business requires difficult decisions. Abandoning your family isn't business. It's cowardice." For the first time in 20 years, Henry looked directly at his son. The resemblance was undeniable, the same analytical eyes, the same sharp features. But where Henry's face had always carried arrogance, Daniel's held something else entirely, purpose without pride, power without poison. "Do you hate me?" Henry asked, the question seemingly pulled from somewhere deep. Daniel considered this carefully, letting silence fill the sterile room. "Hate would mean you still matter to me emotionally. You don't. You're data now. A case study. A cautionary tale I use to train analysts about corporate psychopathy. That's cold. No, that's accurate. Cold would be letting you rot here without thought. Instead, I think about you every day, not as my father, but as an example of what happens when success comes without soul." Henry's composure cracked. "Everything I built is gone. Everything you stole has been returned. There's a difference. Your mother," Henry started, then stopped. "Remarried. Happily." Daniel pulled out his phone, showing a photo of Margaret at her recent wedding to Paul Anderson, a literature professor from Temple University. She was laughing, truly laughing in a way Henry had never seen. Paul reads poetry to her, not because an assistant researched it, but because he actually loves it. They travel to places without checking property values. They measure their wealth in moments, not mergers. "I made you both rich with that divorce settlement. You gave us freedom from you. That was worth more than any amount." Henry's shoulders sagged. The man who'd never admitted fault, never shown weakness, suddenly looked every one of his 63 years. "I don't even know basic things about you. Your favorite color, what you studied. If you ever played sports, blue, architecture and finance. Soccer, but I quit to work construction." Daniel stood to leave, not because you deserve to know, but because even strangers get common courtesy. "Will you visit again?" "No, I have 17 more years here, minimum. And I have a life to live, a company to run, a family to build correctly." Daniel pressed his palm against the glass briefly, a gesture that could have meant goodbye or good riddance. "You know what the saddest part is, Henry. If you'd stayed that day at the funeral, if you'd held my mother while she grieved, if you'd been excited about my birth, you'd still be wealthy, still successful, still respected. Your empire fell not because of what you built, but because of what you abandoned." Henry watched his son walk away, his reflection in the bulletproof glass showing him what he'd become, a cautionary tale in an orange jumpsuit, a man who'd gained the whole world but lost the only things that actually mattered. The metal door closed with a finality that echoed through Henry's remaining years. The rain fell again at a funeral, but this time, everything was different. 20 years after that October day at Riverside Cemetery, Daniel Sullivan stood at another graveside. Henry Harrison had died alone in his studio apartment, discovered 3 days after a massive heart attack by a neighbor concerned about accumulated mail. The man who'd once commanded $3 billion left behind nothing but a donated body and a handwritten will, leaving his prison library books to the detention center. Only 12 people attended the service Daniel had quietly arranged and paid for. Margaret wasn't among them. She was traveling through Italy with Paul, finally visiting the architecture she'd only studied in books. But she'd sent Daniel with something, a single white rose and a note that read, "For the father you could have been." Daniel's impact on corporate America had become impossible to ignore. The Sullivan Standard, his framework for ethical business practices, was taught at every major business school. Companies paid millions to have Integrity Analytics audit their practices before scandals emerged. 3 federal laws bore his fingerprint, including the Corporate Family Responsibility Act, which prevented executives from hiding assets during divorces involving children. "Your biological father's greatest contribution," Daniel said at the graveside, rain pattering against his umbrella, "was serving as the example of everything leadership shouldn't be." His fall created the momentum for reform that protected millions of families from similar abandonment. The twins, Rebecca and Amanda Walsh, stood beside Daniel. They'd both graduated from Integrity Analytics' entry-level program, working their way up without special treatment. Rebecca now ran the Sullivan Foundation's legal aid division. Amanda had become a forensic accountant, specializing in exposing hidden assets in divorce cases. They'd transformed their shame into purpose, their inherited guilt into earned redemption. "He never knew us," Amanda said quietly, placing a small stone on the casket, a Jewish tradition she'd adopted from her new husband's family. "But maybe that protected us from becoming him." After his release from federal prison, Henry had worked as a janitor in one of his former buildings, pushing a mop through lobbies where he'd once made million-dollar deals. Former associates would pass without recognition, his transformation too complete for their memory to bridge. He'd lived in a subsidized apartment, ironically, one built to code because of Daniel's reforms. Margaret had sent him exactly one communication during those years, a photograph of Daniel accepting the Ethics in Business Award from the president. On the back she'd written, "He became everything you never were." Henry had carried that photo until his death, found it in his wallet beside a expired driver's license and a food stamp card. The cemetery workers began lowering the casket. Daniel thought about hatred, about revenge, about the weight of abandonment he'd carried for decades. But standing there, successful beyond any measurement his father would have understood, he felt only completion. Not satisfaction, that was too strong. Not forgiveness, that was too generous. Just the simple closing of a circle that had begun with cruelty and ended with consequence. "Rest in peace, Henry Harrison," Daniel said as dirt covered the casket. "Your story is over, but the lessons from it will outlive us all." As the small group dispersed, Daniel looked at the headstone he'd ordered. It read simply, "Henry Harrison, 1961 to 2045, father, husband, cautionary tale. Subscribe and share if you believe every abandonment story deserves a comeback. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying those who hurt us, it's building something so magnificent from our pain that their cruelty becomes the foundation of our greatness." The rain stopped as Daniel walked away, sun breaking through clouds for the first time that day. Behind him, Henry Harrison's grave joined thousands of others, unremarkable except for the story it represented. A billionaire who abandoned everything that mattered and died with nothing, while the son he'd thrown away became everything a father should inspire.